After saving the starving Apache POW girl, the cowboy said, "You're under my protection now." The desert wind moved slowly across the dry land, lifting dust into the air and carrying it toward a small military holding camp built far from any town. The camp stood under the burning sun, surrounded by wooden fences and guarded by tired men who had seen too much hardship. Life there was not loud, but it was heavy. Every face carried a story of loss, fear, or regret. Among the prisoners inside the fence was a young Apache girl who looked too small to be standing in such a harsh place. She sat close to one corner of the fence, where a thin shadow from a wooden post gave a little shade during the hottest hours of the day. Her clothes were worn and too large for her thin body. Her cheeks were hollow, and her dark eyes seemed bigger than they should have been. She did not cry. She did not beg. She simply watched the world around her in silence. The other prisoners spoke in low voices or rested against the fence, saving their energy. Some of them tried to stay hopeful. Others had already given up, but the girl stayed apart from everyone. She hugged her knees close to her chest and kept her head slightly lowered as if she wanted to disappear. Her name was Apache, though no one in the camp had asked. She had lost her family during the conflict that had swept across the land. One day she had been surrounded by familiar faces and the comfort of home. The next day everything had changed. The journey to the camp had been long and frightening. Since then, time had felt slow and endless. Food was given in small portions. Water was shared carefully. Apache always waited until others took their share before stepping forward. Even then, she moved quietly, almost apologetically. If someone pushed past her, she did not argue. If someone took a little more than their part, she did not complain. Hunger had become something she accepted as normal. Each evening, when the sun began to sink below the horizon, the sky turned orange and pink. The beauty of it felt strange in a place filled with sadness. Apache would look at the sky for a long time, as if searching for something in the colors. Maybe she was remembering the open land she once knew. Maybe she was wondering if anyone out there still remembered her. Most soldiers did not pay attention to her. To them, she was just another prisoner in a camp that held many. They had their own duties, their own worries. Some of them were not unkind, but they kept their distance. It was easier not to see too much. One hot afternoon, the sound of hooves broke the usual silence. A cowboy rode toward the camp entrance, leading a small wagon filled with supplies. His name was Daniel Hayes. He was known in the area as a hard-working rancher who kept to himself. He was not a soldier, but he often delivered goods to the camp, because his ranch was the closest one nearby. Daniel removed his hat as he spoke to the guards. His face was sunburned from long days outside, and lines near his eyes showed years of hard work. After finishing his conversation, he began unloading sacks of grain and other items. He worked quietly, focused on his task. As he carried a crate past the fence, his eyes moved across the group of prisoners without much thought. But then he noticed something that made him slow down. In the corner of the fence, a small figure tried to stand and nearly fell back to the ground. It was Apache. She had reached for a small piece of bread that had fallen near the fence. Her hands trembled as she picked it up. Instead of eating it quickly, she held it close to her chest for a moment, as if deciding whether to save it for later. Her movements were careful and weak at the same time. Daniel stopped walking. He had seen hunger before. He had grown up during difficult times. He remembered nights when his own stomach felt empty, and mornings when he had to work harder than his strength allowed. He knew that look in her eyes. It was not just hunger. It was exhaustion and quiet fear mixed together. For a few seconds, the world around him seemed to fade. The voices of the guards and the sound of the wind became distant. All he could see was the girl trying to stay strong even when her body was failing her. One of the guards noticed Daniel standing still. "Everything all right?" the guard asked. Daniel nodded slowly. "Yeah," he replied, though his eyes were still on the girl. He forced himself to continue working. He stacked the crates, wiped his hands on his trousers, and spoke politely when spoken to. But his thoughts kept returning to that corner of the fence. Apache felt his gaze and looked up for just a moment. Their eyes met. She quickly looked away, lowering her head again. She had learned not to expect kindness. Looking at strangers for too long could bring trouble. Silence was safer. When Daniel finished unloading the wagon, he climbed back onto his horse. The sun was still high, and the ride back to his ranch would take time. Before leaving, he glanced once more toward the fence. The girl was still there, sitting in the same place. The small piece of bread was now gone. She leaned against the wooden post, her eyes half closed as if even sitting upright required effort. Daniel felt a tightness in his chest he could not explain. He had come to the camp many times before. He had seen prisoners, something. But something about this child felt different. Maybe it was her silence. Maybe it was the way she held on to that bread. as if it were the most valuable thing in the world. He tipped his hat to the guards and rode away. The road back to his ranch was long and dusty. The desert stretched wide in every direction. Usually Daniel enjoyed the quiet of the ride. It gave him time to think about cattle, fences, and the small problems of ranch life. But that day his mind would not rest. He pictured the girl again and again. He imagined her sitting there after sunset, when the desert air turned cold. He wondered if she had anyone left in the world. He wondered how long she could survive in that condition. By the time he reached his ranch, the sky was dark. He fed his horse, washed his face, and sat down for supper. The food on his plate suddenly felt heavy. He stared at it for a long moment before taking a bite. He tried to tell himself that it was not his responsibility. The camp had its own rules. The guards had their duties. He was just a rancher delivering supplies. But the image of hollow eyes and trembling hands would not leave him. That night, as the wind moved gently outside his small house, Daniel lay awake longer than usual. He turned from one side to the other, listening to the quiet sounds of the land. Sleep did not come easily. Far away, in the corner of the wooden fence, a pony lay on the hard ground, staring at the stars above. The desert sky was clear, filled with bright lights that seemed close enough to touch. She remembered stories her family once told about the stars guiding lost travelers home. She did not know where home was anymore. The camp remained silent, the guards quietly walking their posts. The world felt vast and uncaring, yet somewhere beyond the fence, a man who had seen her only once could not forget her face. Neither of them knew that this simple moment, a glance across a dusty yard, was the beginning of a story that would change both their lives forever. The next morning, the sun rose slowly over the desert, spreading soft golden light across the wide land. Daniel Hayes had barely slept. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the same image, a thin girl sitting in the corner of a wooden fence, holding a small piece of bread like it was the most precious thing in the world. He stepped outside his small ranch house before the air grew too hot. The land was quiet except for the gentle sound of cattle moving in the distance. Normally, mornings were his favorite time of day. They felt peaceful and full of possibility. But today his thoughts felt heavy. He fed the horses and checked the water troughs, trying to focus on his work. He told himself that life at the camp was not something he could change. The guards had their rules. The officers made their decisions. He was only a rancher who delivered supplies when needed. But no matter how hard he tried to push the thought away, the girl's face returned to his mind. He remembered how she had almost fallen when trying to stand. He remembered the way her hands trembled. He had seen hunger before, but there had been something different in her silence. She had not begged. She had not cried. She had simply endured. Daniel walked back into his house and stood in the middle of the small room. A loaf of fresh bread sat on the table. There was dried meat hanging near the window. A sack of beans rested in the corner. He stared at the food for a long moment. Then he made a decision. He wrapped some bread and dried meat in a clean cloth. He added a small bottle of water. He did not think too much about what might happen. He only knew he could not ride past that fence again and pretend he had seen nothing. Within an hour he was riding back toward the camp. The desert seemed even hotter that day. Dust rose behind his horse as he moved quickly across the land. His heart beat faster than usual, though he was not sure why. Perhaps it was because he knew helping her would not be simple. People did not always welcome kindness, especially in places filled with rules and fear. When he reached the camp, the guards recognized him and waved him through. One of them smiled and said, "Back again so soon?" Daniel nodded. "Forgot to check on something," he replied calmly. He tied his horse near the entrance and walked inside with steady steps. He tried not to look too eager or too concerned. He did not want to draw attention. The prisoners were already awake, sitting quietly or moving slowly in the yard. The sun was climbing higher. Daniel's eyes searched the fence until he found her. A pony was in the same corner, though she looked even weaker than the day before. She leaned against the wooden post, her eyes half open. For a moment, he wondered if she had eaten anything since he last saw her. He walked slowly along the fence as if inspecting it. When he reached her corner, he stopped and crouched down, keeping a little distance so he would not frighten her. Her body became still. Her eyes watched him carefully, filled with caution. Daniel did not speak at first. He simply placed the small cloth bundle on the ground near the fence, close enough for her to reach, but not so close that it felt forced. Then he stepped back. "It's for you," he said softly. She did not move. Her eyes moved from his face to the bundle and back again. She had learned that nothing came without a reason. Nothing came without a cost. Daniel understood that look. He had seen it in animals that had been mistreated, fear mixed with doubt. He kept his hands visible and stayed still. "No one will take it," he added gently. It's yours. For a long moment, nothing happened. The sounds of the camp continued around them. Boots on dirt, low conversations, the creaking of wood. But in that small corner, it felt like time had slowed. Finally, hunger overcame fear. A pony slowly reached forward and pulled the bundle toward her. She unwrapped the cloth carefully. When she saw the bread and dried meat, her eyes widened slightly. She looked up at him again as if trying to understand why. Daniel gave her a small nod. She began to eat, but not quickly. She broke the bread into small pieces, chewing slowly, as if afraid it would disappear. She held the water bottle in both hands, taking careful sips. Daniel felt relief spread through him. He had not realized how tense he had been until that moment. A guard walking nearby noticed them. "What's going on there?" the guard asked. Just checking the fence," Daniel replied calmly, and she looked like she needed something. They all need something. Daniel did not argue. He knew there was no point in starting a debate. Instead, he simply stood there a little longer, making sure no one interfered. When a pony finished eating, she folded the cloth neatly and held it in her lap. She did not speak, but she looked at him differently now. The fear had not disappeared, but there was a small spark of something else, curiosity, maybe even the beginning of trust. Daniel tipped his hat slightly before standing up. I'll be around," he said quietly. He walked away, pretending to examine supplies near a wagon, but inside he felt something shift. He had crossed an invisible line. It was a small act, yet it meant more than he expected. Over the next few days, he found reasons to return to the camp. Sometimes he brought extra water. Other times, he carried small portions of food hidden in his saddlebag. He never made a show of it. He never tried to draw attention. Each visit followed the same careful pattern. He would place the bundle near her. He would step back. She would wait, watching him closely. Then she would eat. Slowly, something changed. Her movements became steadier. The deep shadows under her eyes lightened a little. She began sitting up straighter instead of leaning against the fence all day. Though she still spoke no words, her silence felt different now. It was no longer empty. It felt observant. One afternoon, as he approached, she was already watching for him. He noticed it right away. She was standing, not sitting. Her posture was still thin and fragile, but there was more strength in it. When he placed the food down, she did not hesitate as long as before. Before eating, she looked up at him and gave the smallest nod. It was a simple gesture, but it felt like a bridge forming between them. Not everyone approved of Daniel's visits. Some guards began whispering. A few shook their heads. "You're getting too involved," one of them warned. Daniel responded calmly. "She's just a child." The guard sighed. "This place isn't meant for comfort." Daniel did not answer. He knew that rules often ignored kindness, but he also believed that small acts could matter. At night, back at his ranch, he found himself thinking less about cattle and more about the future. What would happen to her? How long would she remain there? Could she survive without steady help? He did not yet know the answers, but he knew one thing clearly. He could no longer pretend she was invisible. Back at the camp, a pony lay under the stars again. This time her stomach was not painfully empty. She held the clean cloth in her hands, the one he had used to wrap the food. She had washed it with a little water and kept it carefully folded. For the first time since arriving at the camp, she felt a small shift inside her heart. It was not full trust. It was not complete safety, but it was the feeling that someone had chosen to see her. And sometimes being seen was the first step towards survival. Neither of them realized how much this simple choice, a piece of bread, a quiet promise without words, would begin to change everything. The days grew warmer as the desert moved from early spring towards summer. The air inside the camp felt dry and heavy, and even the wooden fences seemed tired under the sun. But something small had begun to change in one quiet corner near the post where a pony used to sit without moving. She no longer stayed curled against the wood for the entire day. She still kept to herself, but she stood more often now. Her steps were slow, yet steady. The food Daniel brought had given her strength, but more than that, it had given her something she had not felt in a long time, the feeling that someone cared whether she survived or not. Daniel continued to visit the camp every few days. Sometimes he had a reason, like delivering supplies. Other times he created one. He would check the fence lines or ask about repairs that were not urgent. The guards noticed, but most of them did not question him too much. He was known as a responsible man who caused no trouble. Each time he entered, his eyes searched for her first pond. One afternoon, he arrived to find a small group of men standing near a pony's corner. They were not speaking kindly. They laughed as she tried to lift a small bucket of water that looked too heavy for her thin arms. The bucket slipped, spilling some water onto the dirt. One of the men shook his head. "Too weak to even carry that," he muttered. Apone lowered her eyes and tried again, her hands shaking. Daniel felt something tighten inside him. He walked toward them without rushing, but with clear purpose. His boots pressed firmly into the dry ground. "That bucket looks heavy," he said calmly, stepping closer. The men turned to look at him. One of them shrugged. "I should learn to manage." Daniel bent down and lifted the bucket easily. He handed it back to Apone, but instead of letting her struggle alone, he walked beside her toward the water barrel. His voice remained steady. "She's gaining strength," he said. "It takes time." The men exchanged glances but said nothing more. They stepped aside, losing interest. Apone carefully poured the water into the barrel. When she finished, she stood very still, as if unsure what would happen next. Daniel set the empty bucket down. He looked at her directly for a moment. She met his eyes but did not look away as quickly as she used to. "You don't have to do everything at once," he told her gently. "Strength comes step by step." She did not answer, but her shoulders relaxed slightly. That evening, after most of the yard had grown quiet, Daniel returned to her corner with a small bundle of food. The sky above them was turning soft orange as the sun lowered. Before placing the bundle down, he paused. The words had been forming in his mind for days. He had thought about them during long rides and quiet nights at his ranch. He had watched how others treated her, not cruelly, but without care. He had seen how easily she could disappear in a place like this. He crouched down, keeping his voice low but clear. "You're under my protection now." The sentence was simple, but it carried weight. Apone stared at him. She did not fully understand every word, but she understood the tone. There was no anger in it, no pity, only certainty. He continued, speaking slowly. "No one will trouble you, not while I'm here." For a long moment, the desert wind was the only sound between them. Then something changed in her expression. The guarded look that had been there since the beginning softened just a little. She studied his face carefully, as if measuring whether his promise was real. Daniel did not look away. He wanted her to see that he meant it. From that day forward, his visits felt different. He no longer stood at a distance as only a helper. He stood like someone who had taken responsibility. If anyone spoke harshly near her, he stepped closer. If she struggled with a task, he offered guidance instead of stepping in too quickly. He wanted her to grow stronger, not dependent. Some of the guards began whispering more openly now. "You're acting like she belongs to you," one of them said one morning. Daniel shook his head. "She belongs to herself," he replied. "I'm just making sure she gets a fair chance." The guard frowned, but did not argue further. Pony began to move differently around the yard. She no longer stayed pressed against the fence for safety. She walked across the open space with cautious but growing confidence. When she carried small items, her hands trembled less. One afternoon, as Daniel approached, he noticed she was watching him from across the yard. Not with fear, but with expectation. He felt a quiet warmth at that. When he reached her, he placed the bundle down as usual. But this time, before opening it, she spoke. Her voice was soft and careful, as if the words had not been used in a long time. "Apone," she said, touching her chest lightly. It took Daniel a second to understand. "That's your name?" he asked gently. She nodded. He repeated it slowly. "Apone." He made sure to say it clearly, wanting to honor it. A faint light passed through her eyes when she heard her name spoken correctly. It was the first time anyone in the camp had used it. "My name is Daniel," he added, placing his hand over his own chest. She studied him, then gave a small nod. That simple exchange felt larger than any long conversation. Over the next week, they began building quiet understanding. He taught her a few simple English words. She listened carefully, repeating them in a soft voice. Sometimes she taught him small words from her own language. Though their conversations were short, they were filled with respect. The promise he had made, that she was under his protection, began to show in small ways. When a supply wagon arrived late one evening, bringing extra work for the prisoners, Daniel stayed longer than usual. He noticed Apone trying to lift another heavy object. Before anyone could mock her again, he spoke firmly. "She'll handle lighter tasks," he said. "That's enough for today." His tone left no room for argument. The men nearby exchanged looks but stepped back. Apone glanced at him with surprise. She was not used to someone speaking for her, but she did not feel small because of it. Instead, she felt seen. As days passed, whispers spread beyond the camp. Some people in the nearby settlement questioned why a cowboy would concern himself so deeply with a young Apache prisoner. A few warned him to stay careful. But Daniel did not let the talk change his course. He believed that protection did not mean control. It meant standing beside someone when they had no one else. It meant using your strength to create space for another person to breathe. One evening, as the sun disappeared and shadows stretched long across the ground, Apache stood near the fence watching the horizon. Daniel joined her quietly. "You miss home," he said softly. She nodded once. He did not ask her to explain. He understood that some losses were too large for words. After a few minutes, she looked at him and spoke slowly, choosing each word with care. "Why help?" The question was simple but honest. Daniel thought about it. He could have given many answers, but he chose the truest one. "Because someone should," he said. She held his gaze for a long time, then looked back at the horizon. But this time, her posture was straighter. The wind moved through her hair, and she did not look as small as she once had. In that quiet desert camp, surrounded by fences and rules, something rare was growing. It was not loud. It did not demand attention, but it was steady. A promise had been spoken. And for the first time since arriving there, Apache did not feel completely alone. The desert days grew longer, and the heat settled deep into the dry earth. Inside the camp, life continued in the same steady rhythm. Morning roll call, simple tasks, small food portions, long hours of waiting. Yet in one quiet corner near the fence, something meaningful was changing. Apache no longer looked like a shadow against the wooden posts. The thin, fragile girl who once struggled to stand now walked with slow but steady steps. She still carried sadness in her eyes, but it no longer felt empty. There was awareness there and something stronger, determination. Daniel noticed every small change. He had begun visiting almost daily now. Sometimes he had real reasons. Other times he simply made one. He repaired loose boards, checked supply lists, or spoke with the guards about practical matters. He kept his voice calm and his behavior respectful. He did not want anyone to think he was causing trouble. He only wanted space to keep his promise. The words he had spoken, "You're under my protection now," were not something he took lightly. At first, Apache had relied on him in silence. She would wait for him to bring food. She would step back when others spoke too loudly. But slowly, something inside her began to grow. One afternoon, Daniel arrived to find her helping an older woman carry folded blankets across the yard. The blankets were not heavy, but they required balance and care. Apache held her side firmly, her steps careful but confident. Daniel stopped for a moment and watched. She noticed him and gave a small nod before finishing her task. She did not rush toward him the way a frightened child might. She did not cling. She completed what she had started. That small detail made Daniel smile quietly to himself. When she returned to the fence area, he walked over. "You're stronger," he said gently. She looked down at her hands, flexing her fingers slightly. "Better," she answered in simple English. Her voice had become clearer over time. She practiced words whenever he visited. Sometimes she struggled, but she kept trying. "You've worked hard," he told her. She shook her head lightly. "You—" Daniel paused. "I helped," he agreed, "but you stood up on your own." She thought about that. The idea seemed new to her, that she was not simply surviving because of someone else, but because she was choosing to keep going. Trust between them had grown in quiet ways. She no longer flinched when he stepped closer. She no longer guarded every movement as if expecting harm. Instead, she watched him with thoughtful eyes, as though trying to understand not just what he did, but who he was. One evening, after most of the yard had grown calm, Daniel brought a small book with him. It was old and worn, something he had kept since he was young. It contained simple drawings of animals and common objects with English words written beneath them. He sat on an overturned crate near the fence and held the book open so she could see. "Horse," he said, pointing to the picture. She looked at the drawing, then at him. "Horse," she repeated carefully. He nodded. "Good." They went through several pages. Tree, water, sky, hand. She listened closely, repeating each word. Sometimes she smiled slightly when she got it right. The smile was rare, but when it appeared, it changed her entire face. For a moment, the camp did not feel like a place of waiting. It felt like a classroom under open sky. A few guards noticed the lessons. Some said nothing. Others exchanged uncertain glances. One guard approached Daniel later that day. "You're teaching her now?" he asked. "Just words," Daniel replied calmly. "Language makes things easier." The guard studied him. You're putting a lot of effort into this. She deserves a future. The guard did not argue, but his silence carried questions. Daniel understood that not everyone would see things the same way. But he had long ago stopped worrying about opinions when he believed he was doing what was right. Over time, Aponi began helping with more responsibilities inside the camp. She organized small supplies, assisted with washing clothes, and even helped calm younger children when they felt afraid. She had always been observant. Now she used that awareness to support others. One afternoon, a sudden dust storm swept across the desert. The wind rose quickly, carrying sand into the yard. People rushed to secure loose items and find shelter. A small child near the center of the yard began crying, frightened by the swirling dust. Before Daniel could move, Aponi ran toward the child. She knelt down, wrapped her arms gently around him, and guided him toward the safer side of the fence, where the wind was weaker. Daniel watched from across the yard, his heart steady but full. She was no longer the girl who had sat trembling with a piece of bread. She was becoming someone who could offer comfort. After the storm passed, Daniel found her brushing sand from her hair. He handed her a small cloth to wipe her face. "You handled that well," he said. She looked at him, slightly confused by the praise. "Help," she said simply, as if explaining her action. He nodded. "Yes, you helped." That evening, as the sky turned deep blue and stars began appearing, they stood quietly near the fence. "You're not the same as when I first saw you," Daniel said. She looked out toward the horizon. "Not same," she agreed softly. There was a long pause. Then she asked, "When? Leave?" The question hung in the air. She had not asked about the future before. She had focused only on surviving each day. Now she was thinking ahead. Daniel considered his words carefully. "I don't know when," he answered honestly, "but I'm working on it." She studied his face, searching for doubt. She found none. Trust was no longer fragile between them. It was steady. In the days that followed, Daniel spoke quietly with camp officials about her condition. He explained how much she had improved. He pointed out her willingness to work, her ability to learn. He suggested that perhaps she could be placed under supervision outside the camp one day. The conversations were slow and cautious. Nothing changed immediately, but seeds were planted. Meanwhile, Aponi continued building strength in her own way. She woke early. She completed tasks without complaint. She practiced English words under her breath. She no longer hid in corners. One morning, as sunlight poured across the yard, she approached Daniel before he reached her usual spot. "Daniel," she said clearly. It was the first time she had spoken his name without hesitation. He smiled. "Yes?" She placed her hand lightly over her chest. Not afraid." The words were simple, but they carried deep meaning. Daniel felt a quiet warmth spread through him. "That's good," he replied. "You shouldn't be." Protection was never meant to create dependence. It was meant to create safety until strength could grow. And strength had grown. The camp still stood, surrounded by wooden fences. The desert wind still moved across the land. Rules and uncertainty remained. But within those boundaries, a young girl had found her footing again, and the cowboy who had once seen her as a fragile figure in the corner now saw something entirely different, a person standing tall, ready for whatever came next.